from Lime Doodle Design, and today for my Doodling with Debbie feature for Simon Says Stamp, I'm taking a small leaf image from the One with Nature set and creating a watercoloured leaf background. Today's card design was inspired by an autumn scarf I saw with outlined leaves over the top of blocks of colour. However, I wanted to create a holiday card and so chose a colour scheme based on a traditional colour palette of red and green. However, I think bringing in the pastels adds a nice twist. Along with the One with Nature stamp set, the watercolours I'm using today are from Daniel Smith. In particular, you can find the colours that I keep in my palette on this dot sheet from Simon Says Stamp. The great price point of these dot sheets allow you to experiment with the colours to find out which ones you like before investing further. I've taken the small leaf outline image from the One with Nature set, and on a piece of Archer's hot pressed watercolour card, I'm planning out where I want to stamp the leaves. For the first row of leaves, I'm planning on having one leaf in the centre and two either side. I marked the base of the middle leaf with a pencil and then placed equidistant tick marks for the other two leaves. I'm happy for my pattern to be organic and less than perfect, however these pencil marks will keep the pattern from straying too far. I've placed the watercolour card in the Mini Misty and then tapped on some EK Success powder tool. I seem to have pushed the brush of this tool in too far, and so for now, until I get around to buying a new one, I'm tapping the powder onto the card and then dusting it around with the Range of Perfect Pearls brush. The powder will prevent embossing powder sticking to places I don't want it, and now that the card is prepared, I'm lining up the leaf with the centre tick mark and then stamping with Simon Says Stamp clear embossing ink. This is a sticky ink that the embossing powder I'm going to use will adhere to, and to ensure a good impression, I'm stamping the image twice each time. You could carry on and stamp the rest of the leaves in this row. However, I prefer to stamp and emboss each image before moving on to the next. I'm using Simon Says Stamp Antique Gold embossing powder, sprinkling that over the embossing ink, tapping off any excess and brushing away any stray grains, and then melting the embossing powder with a hot heat tool. I will continue stamping and embossing this leaf until I have a pattern covering the whole of the watercolour card. To help keep this pattern as clean and neat and tidy as possible, I find it helpful to use a piece of acetate. After stamping the first leaf, the stamp is now sticky with embossing ink, and if I laid it on the card while moving the image into place, I could get embossing ink on the card where I don't want it. Using a piece of acetate to cover the card until I'm ready to stamp the image means that I keep the card nice and clean. I will continue stamping and embossing this small leaf in a repeating pattern and using pencil marks to ensure the pattern stays roughly aligned until I have covered the whole piece of watercolour card. One point to note is that I'm using hot pressed watercolour card as the smooth texture of this card ensures a cleaner impression than the rougher texture of cold pressed watercolour card. It did take a little while to stamp all these leaves, and I did extend the pattern over the edges of the card. However, later I will trim this panel down and the leaves on the very edges did get trimmed away. I'm using an eraser to remove the pencil marks, and now this panel is ready for watercolouring. I've used 3M painter's tape to adhere it to a board, and this will help prevent the card from warping when I add the watercolour. I'm mixing up puddles of the watercolours that I plan to use. I want a nice hunter's green, and I've mixed together undersea green with ultramarine blue. For the red I'm using PYRROL Scarlet, but I want to deepen and mute the red slightly, and so I'm mixing it with a little undersea green. When creating pastel watercolours, you don't want to use white paint, but instead use a dilute mixture of paint and water. For the pale pink, I've mixed up a dilute QUINACRIDONE coral, and for the pale blue, a dilute ultramarine turquoise. The painting for this card is really simple. I'm drawing a loose leaf shape slightly larger than the embossed image, and I'm using a size 4 Winsor & Newton brush. I'm not worrying about being precise. I'm going for a more loose organic look. I'm randomly painting the green around several of the leaves. At least to start off with, I like to keep areas of colour to uneven numbers, so I painted 7 green leaves before moving on to painting the red ones. Uneven numbers, 1, 3, 5, 7, etc., are supposed to be more appealing to the eye, and so I painted 5 red leaves before moving on to the pastel colours. I'm not as worried about how many of the paler shades I will be using, as these colours aren't as dominant. As I mentioned, the painting for this card is really simple, only one layer of paint and no shading or anything. The paint does settle in puddles between the embossed lines to give some variation in colour though. Now with the painting finished, I've dried the panel with my heat tool, and then I'm using Heidi Swap Gold Colour Shine to add splatters. It's important to give the bottle a good shake to mix the gold pigment thoroughly, and then I use the tube from the bottle to splatter the mixture. I've set that to one side to dry while I work on the sentiment. I'm using the stained glass greeting set from Southsea Stamp and stamping the Merry Sentiment from the set in clear embossing ink on a lipstick red card. I stamped the sentiment twice to get a good impression and then sprinkled with white embossing powder before heat setting. I did think about using antique gold embossing powder again, but I really like how white embossing powder pops off the coloured card for sentiments and makes them easy to read. I attached the matching stained glass greeting die with washi tape and then ran that through my die cutting machine. However, I wasn't totally sure about the main part of the greeting being in red, as it seemed to blend with the busy background a little, and so I stamped and die cut the sentiment again from black card and liked how that held its own much better. To complete the sentiment, I stamped and white heat embossed a complimentary sentiment from the stained glass greeting set in clear embossing ink on lipstick red card, sprinkled with white embossing powder and heat set before trimming into a skinny banner. I added foam adhesive to the back of the leaf background panel and both sentiment pieces. I then added the panel to a Desert Storm card base, and then the sentiment pieces I set at the lower third of the panel. I added a trio of gold sequins which I attached with Ranger Multimedia Matte, and then that completes this card using a small stamp to create a watercoloured background pattern. On the Southsea Stamp blog you will find a coordinating blog post, as well as details of the supplies that I've used today. If you want to find me, I blog over at limedoodledesign.com. I want to thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.